Last night, Kirby and the Forgotten Land Star-Crossed Worlds hit Nintendo Switch 2, and I spent quite a lot of time playing and enjoying the new version of the game. Firstly, it really made me realize and appreciate just how this specific title, much like Mario Party Jamboree, has been completely ignored and downplayed by the general Nintendo community. Both of these games were major releases on Nintendo Switch 2, and for whatever reason, everyone's been bending over backwards trying to ignore them. And secondly, I began to think a little bit more about Forgotten Land as a whole because it's been a couple of years now since launch. This came out in 2022. This was a huge deal for Kirby fans. This was the first 3D Kirby game ever. This really went above and beyond, really delivering an excellent experience to longtime fans and new players alike. And I think has established itself as the best Kirby game ever. So the fact that the best Kirby game ever is getting an expansion on Nintendo Switch 2 is something that really should have gotten a lot more attention and hype than it ended up getting. But these two things in conjunction made me realize that not only was Kirby in the Forgotten Land one of the best Kirby games ever made, one of the best games on Nintendo Switch, this huge major milestone for HAL Labs and Nintendo as a whole. One of their major characters, Kirby, a huge stepping stone forward to making the character a recognizable household name. Not only is this a major accomplishment on that front, Forgotten Land has well outpaced it. Forgotten Land is the best Kirby game ever made, but as time has gone on and I've come back to the game, and now that we're experiencing it on Nintendo Switch 2, it's time we take that next step and acknowledge that Kirby and the Forgotten Land is actually one of the best Nintendo games ever produced. From the very first trailer, it was apparent that this game was something special, being fully 3D and some of the new features shown off and the new location. It really gave the vibe as if HAL Labs had planned something spectacular. By the time you boot up that first level and play through the first stage, you find yourself enamored with the creativity, the mechanics, and just the experience of playing Kirby in the Forgotten Land for the first time. It's really easy to forget how good certain video games are. Something like The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time was a genre-defining classic when it came out, but if you played it in the years since when it was competing with more technically demanding games, it is very easy to kind of misrepresent why or how much of an influence it actually was on gamer culture. In the 2000s, people would misrepresent the game by saying Navi was annoying or that it was too simplistic and that it didn't really have a story, or that it was like essentially a remake or a retelling of the last game, A Link to the Past. They wouldn't really understand what made Ocarina of Time great. And in this day and age, because of all the other games, Zelda games that have come out since, the game has become not as talked about outside of some vague assertion that this is the greatest game of all time. Considering the current state of the gaming industry, where absolute slop is always treated as some major milestone in gaming, it is very important to note that the games that aren't talked about, games like Kirby and the Forgotten Land, games like Mario and Luigi Brothership, games like Princess Peach Showtime, like Pokemon Legends Arceus, games like Fire Emblem Engage, Fire Emblem Three Houses especially, games like this, in spite of not selling as much or being as relevant in their own way, are establishing themselves as some of the best games ever made. So in Kirby and the Forgotten Lands case, it came out the same year as Pokemon Legends Arceus, one of my favorite games ever made, one of my favorite Pokemon games ever, this huge major milestone when it came to the Pokemon brand and IP. My game of the year 2022. I declared Legends Arceus to be this masterpiece, this all-time classic, this great game. And for Forgotten Land, which I didn't like nearly as much because of the length and like the difficulty and stuff like that. It was easy for me at that time to overlook this. After all, if a game didn't win Game of the Year, how can it be considered one of the greatest games of all time? However, when you go back, when you experience these games again, when you play these games again, when you take in like how much fun it actually is to play through these stages over and over again and experience the mechanics and 100% the game, you start to reevaluate your initial impression. Because I always liked Kirby in the Forgotten Land. I always thought it was a great game, but the more experience you get with it, the more you play the game and engage with it and really start understanding like the appeal and the design decisions, like the more you start to evaluate how it stacks up to other games. There are plenty of games that I played that I really, really enjoyed that I eventually fell off of because they eventually had problems that you couldn't see and couldn't fathom, like Yeast 9 is a really good example where the first 10 or so hours were these really gripping, fun, just action packed, really well written RPG experience, on the same level as Yeast 8, the previous game, but then eventually it falls off and becomes this convoluted mess. On the contrary, you have games like this, games like Kirby and the Forgotten Land, that not only are stellar all the way through, up to 100% completion, but they manage to excel even beyond that. Simply coming back to the game and playing through it again will make you realize just how good the game actually is. Like, it is a special thing indeed when you 100% a game and then come back and play it again. Like when I 100%ed like Kirby and the Forgotten Land, I shelved it, didn't think about it again, and when it came time to produce my top 10 Nintendo Switch games video, I popped it in my Switch, and it just barely cracked my top 10. So, Kirby and the Forgotten Land is something that I've come back to, played, and enjoyed since its release. And considering the release of this new expansion, Star-Crossed Worlds, I am now getting to experience the game in a new way, with higher quality visuals and a little bit of new content. And it is spectacular. Experiencing this game again has really driven home the fact that this game is a downright masterpiece. If Kirby and the Forgotten Land and its continued success and legacy has taught us anything, is that we really do need to evaluate how games are considered the best ever. Because there are lots of games that were considered all-time classics, games like Metal Gear Solid 3 and Final Fantasy 8 and Okami, that really don't no longer deserve to be in the top 100 games ever made, to be considered among that number. And games like this, Kirby and the Forgotten Land, games like Mario and Luigi's Brothership, games like that, like really should be considered to take their place, and that's something that we as like a community really need to talk about more, is that like what games in the gaming industry are getting written off and ignored for petty reasons, because it's very easy to see why Kirby and the Forgotten Land has not been considered like this major milestone in gaming, because it is an adult. It isn't a PC exclusive. It doesn't have like dating or romance options. It doesn't pander to woke audiences. This is just the culmination of what Kirby has been building up to for like 30 years. We got like major lore additions in this game. We got like, amazing an amazing finale, new characters, a new setting, fleshed out world. Forgotten Land is a downright masterpiece, and yet it was written off and ignored because the Game Awards wanted to give their Game of the Year showcase to It Takes Two instead. A game that was almost immediately completely forgotten and will never really stay relevant or endure as an all-time classic. But there's no doubt in my mind that Kirby and the Forgotten Land is indeed a classic. It is a game that, in spite of its age, has remained very relevant among the Nintendo community. It is something that we point to as the high point, one of the high points, many, many, many high points of the Nintendo Switch life cycle. I've come out and said that this game is better than Donkey Kong Bonanza and Super Mario Odyssey. This is like a really good example of just how far beyond Nintendo is compared to the competition. Because last year, the Game Awards tried to give a Game of the Year nomination to Astro Bot and paid for, right? This mediocre 3D platformer that nobody played, remember, talked about. It was supposed to be this huge major deal. And it was very obvious to me immediately that that game was not going to live up to or compete with Kirby and the Forgotten Land. It doesn't matter if they give the competition awards. It doesn't matter how much the game sells. It doesn't matter like what they try and pull. The reality is Kirby and the Forgotten Land is is going to continue to be successful and find an audience in spite of what the rest of the industry says and does, because this is a game that was built off dozens of fantastic experiences over the decades. And as a result of that, upon release, it immediately had a dedicated audience waiting for it. And I do think that is a major thing that Sony has never been able to do, is that they've never been able to build up a brand. They've never been able to build up an identity. You only buy PlayStation products because it's what game journals tell you to buy. It's not because you genuinely like the developers, you genuinely like the characters, you genuinely like the games. Like, you hype yourselves up for PlayStation because you simply don't know any better. And I think when you compare that to what happened with Kirby and the Forgotten Land, where you just have lots of people coming out and just acknowledging this game as a downright masterpiece, like, this is what real success looks like. This is a game that people are going to look back on love forever, long after Astrobot is completely forgotten.